In this lecture, we're going to look at a number of general principles along with some reminders, and then we're going to do a couple of proofs that are a little bit unusual compared to what we've done so far. So first, the reminders. We know that when we're doing proofs with quantifiers, there are some things that we need to be careful about, and this is a little list of special things from the text that I just want to point out to you. When you bring an E into a proof, the first time an E appears in a proof will almost always be by using existential instantiation. There's really no other reason to bring an E into a proof otherwise. E does not call for an indent. So just keep that in mind. Bringing an E into a proof doesn't mean that you have to indent. On the other hand, bringing a variable into a proof, a free variable for the first time, does call for an indent. The first time a variable shows up on a line free, it must be indented. Now, we've seen proofs where you introduce the variable and then make an assumption on the same line. For example, you might be trying to prove fx arrow gx in order to prove for all x fx arrow gx. And one way to do that is to declare the variable by writing an x indented and then indent again and assume fx. But you have to do both of those indents. So when you use that trick of declaring the variable, make sure that you have an indent for the variable declaration, and then if you go on to make an assumption, you have a further indent for that. So two indents on one line. In order to use universal generalization, you must unindent. You apply universal generalization to a line that's on an indented subproof, and then when you apply UG, you take a quantified formula that has the last line of that indented subproof as an instance. Remember that if you bring a variable into a subproof, it can't appear outside that subproof. And if you bring an existential name into a subproof, it can't appear outside that subproof. That second point goes along with another fact. You cannot apply UG to a line that contains an existential name. That's just another way of saying the same thing in effect. So those are some reminders about how to do proofs. Next, we're going to move on to some principles that we can prove, and some of which we will prove, but that in any case are worth noting. So the first one is that we have a bunch of relationships about denied categoricals. The denial of all f are g is some f are not g, and this can be proved in both directions. We're not going to do the proof here, but it's not difficult. You should complete the proof for this biconditional yourself. If you have any trouble, let me know. Likewise, the denial of no f are g is some f are g. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. Do the proof here as well. Moving on, the denial of some f are g is no f are g. That's obviously related to the principle that we just looked at. You should prove it. And the denial of some f are not g is all f are g. So these are principles that are easy to prove, but when we later on look at some techniques for deciding if an argument is invalid, having these things at your fingertips as things that you just know and can apply straightforwardly is going to be important rather. Distribution and factor principles. Quantifiers sometimes distribute over connectives, and here are the principles that we have for doing that. Some of them are more obvious and more straightforward than others. If everything is an f and a g, then everything is an f and everything is a g, and vice versa. So we have distribution of the quantifier over the and you can also factor the universal quantifier out of an and statement. On the other hand, if something is an f and a g, all that follows is that something is an f and something is a g, but we can't turn this around. We can't say that if something's an f and something's a g, then some one thing is an f and a g. That doesn't follow, and we can't construct a proof of it. But you should construct the proof in the left to right direction here. Similar one-way principle. If everything is an f or everything is a g, then it follows that everything is an f or a g. But the converse doesn't follow. If everything is an f or a g, it doesn't follow that everything's an f or everything is a g. In these cases where it only works in one direction, you might want to think about why. You might want to think about examples that demonstrate that. But in any case, for the moment, do the proof either in both directions if it applies, or in one if that's all we have. Another two-way principle. If something's an f or a g, then something's an f or something's a g. And conversely, if something's an f or something's a g, then something is an f or a g. All right, now, when we come to conditionals, we have some asymmetries that eventually we're going to have to worry about. But for the moment, that's not going to come up. What we do see, and it's actually a reflection of those asymmetries, is that we have only one-way principles for the conditionals. So if all f are g, then what we know is that if everything's an f, everything's a g, but we do not know the converse. We can't go from if everything's an f, everything's a g, to all f are g. Likewise, suppose we know that if something's an f, then something's a g. We have a one-way principle. We can go to there's something such that if it's an f, then it's a g. And we're going to look at this proof in one direction later on. But the point for now is that you can't go in the opposite direction. When it comes to the biconditional, we have one principle, and it only applies for the universal quantifier. It doesn't apply for the existential quantifier, and we don't have any principles like this that do. So you should look at the proofs of these things where you can, but we will, as I said, in particular, look at one of these proofs. Carrying on then. Sometimes quantifiers don't do anything. What we've written here includes this double S, this script S, and what we mean to say by this is that putting a quantifier in front of a sentence, by a sentence we mean something that doesn't contain a free variable but that's well formed, is redundant. So a plain English sort of example, or a peculiar English example might be better, is for all x, John is in Boston. Well, that sounds weird in English, but insofar as it means anything, it just means John's in Boston. What we've done here is we've given a more complex example. The bracketed, well-formed formula is a sentence. It doesn't contain any free variables. Slapping a quantifier in front of it doesn't do anything. The unquantified and quantified versions are the same, whether we use a universal quantifier or an existential quantifier. And this is the kind of principle that occasionally comes up when you're trying to figure out what certain kinds of quantified sentences mean. But for the moment, we'll just move on to related cases, which are cases where you've got, and here we're just going to use P, some sentence combined with a connective to some woof with a free variable, and then a quantifier interacting with that. Sometimes you can confine the quantifier. That is to say, you can take the quantifier that governs the whole formula and you can stick it onto just one part. So let's just quickly review these principles here, and you should be ready to prove them. But once again, there's one of them that we'll talk about in more detail when we come to discuss proofs. So here we have for all x, bracket p and fx. Well, the universal quantifier only does anything to the fx part, and so we can simply move it over and attach it onto the f, and we haven't changed the meaning. The same would go if it was an existential. We have exactly the same kind of situation with or. we can simply confine the quantifier to the part that it applies to, whether it's a universal or an existential. Doesn't make any difference. When we come to quantifiers and conditionals, however, the remark we made above about asymmetry applies here and gives us a somewhat interesting result, because the connective arrow is not symmetrical. You can't just turn P arrow Q into Q arrow P. In this case here, we wrote it with the fx on the right and the sentence on the left, but had we done it the other way, the same point would have applied. We could attach the quantifier to the woof that has the free variable. But here, order matters. So on the one hand, when we have a formula like this, for all x bracket P arrow or fx, we can indeed just take that quantifier and attach it to the consequent of the bracketed conditional. The same goes if we have an existential quantifier applying to the conditional. We can take that existential quantifier and attach it just to the fx that follows the arrow. But interestingly enough, when we put the part with the variable in front of the arrow, as we do here, we have for all x bracket fx arrow p, then we can confine the quantifier, but only if we change it. We can take for all x bracket fx arrow p, and that's completely equivalent to for some x fx arrow p. But if we made this a universal quantifier, they wouldn't be equivalent any longer. It wouldn't be two ways of saying the same thing. Likewise here, the fx comes before the arrow, so we have a quantifier in the front, an existential quantifier in this case. We can move it inside, but only if we change it to a universal. So we have a bunch of cases where things behave exactly as you might sort of hope they do. They behave in a simple way. But when it comes to conditionals, we also have two cases that behave in a slightly surprising way, and you want to be aware of this difference. When it comes to the double arrow, we don't have any two-way principles at all. We have a couple of one-way principles, and here they are. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause here. We've just talked about principles so far, and then in the second part of the lecture, we're going to look at two of these cases where the proofs contain something interesting that we haven't seen before.